Often I hear on the internet, and I use the word here quite generously given that most of this discourse occurs in the form of poorly punctuated tweets, the following statements. Why don't AAA studios just make smaller games? It is, on its surface, a reasonable question. A sympathetic question, even. One gets the impression that the person asking it has suffered through a 60-hour open world experience and emerged on the other side somewhat diminished as a human being. Yet, the question reveals something rather telling about the state of economic literacy in games discourse and entertainment discourse in general. Not because the person asking it is foolish, but because the answer requires a level of institutional analysis that our current media environment is, shall we say, structurally disincentivized to provide. So, today we are going to do what game journalists apparently find either too boring or too difficult. We are going to look at how organizations actually work. And I will warn you in advance, by the time we are finished, the game industry will be the least interesting part of this argument. When you hear that a game had a $200 million budget, you are, I am sorry to inform you, hearing the wrong number. The number that actually matters is something called the burn rate. The burn rate is not a budget. A budget is a planning document, a number that somebody wrote in a spreadsheet before the project began. And as we all know, that is usually not accurate to the realities of doing work. The burn rate is the cost of keeping the organization operational every single month, whether any product ships or not. These are not the same number, and confusing them is responsible for roughly 70% of the bad analysis you will encounter on this subject. Here's what I mean. A large AAA studio, not a giant one, a middling one, might employ somewhere between 800 and 1,500 people across development, support, production, and management. That number, however, is not the number it appears to be. Modern AAA development is extensively distributed across contractors, outsourcing houses, co-development partners, and temporary labor. The headcount on LinkedIn and the headcount being carried continuously on payroll are genuinely difficult figures to figure out. But here is what does not change regardless of how you count the bodies. Once an organization reaches a certain scale, it develops a cost floor, a structural minimum below which spending cannot be reduced without causing organizational damage that exceeds the savings. Permanent staff, senior engineers, creative directors, production, infrastructure, legal, finance, HR, and licensing agreements are not variable costs that scale cleanly with project size. They are fixed obligations. They accrue whether the game is in full production, in pre-production, in development hell, or not being made at all. And it is not only labor. Marketing operates under the exact same logic, and this is the part that makes the cost floor argument considerably harder to dismiss. A AAA marketing campaign is not priced according to the scope of the game underneath it. It is priced according to the infrastructure required to launch at AAA scale. A platform launch slot, a presence at major trade events, a global localization rollout across a dozen territories, a coordinated press and influencer campaign timed to a release window that the platform holders control, not the studio. That infrastructure costs roughly the same whether the game underneath it costs $200 million or $20 million. The marketing apparatus has its own cost floor, entirely separate from the labor cost floor, and it does not shrink just because the product does. Which means that even in the hypothetical scenario where a studio somehow solved the labor problem, distributed its headcount down to something a smaller game could justify on its own merits, the marketing and distribution layer above it would still demand AAA scale revenue to break even on AAA scale marketing spend. You would still need the number on the back end, even if you had successfully shrunk the big number on the front end. Apologies for the mishap. So the cost floor is not one wall, It is two. Labor sets a floor on what the production has to cost. Marketing sets a floor on what the production has to earn back. And both floors were set by decisions made when the organization was a different size for a market that may no longer exist. And that cost floor, compounded across a development cycle for 3 to 5 to 8 to 12 years, is the actual economic reality of AAA development and development in the software industry in general. Not the budget, not the executive compensation that journalists love to compare to layoff figure. It is the cost floor and the time it runs. Those more curiously aligned would ask, why does the cost floor keep rising? That's a great question. It's because headcount behaves like a ratchet. A ratchet, for those unfamiliar with the mechanism, is a device that permits motion in one direction and resists it in another. It clicks forward, it does not click back. Headcount in the entertainment industry is a ratchet. During the COVID era, consumer spending on games increased substantially. Studios hired aggressively. This was rational. Expanding output requires expanding capacity. The mechanism click forward. The problem, and this is the problem that nobody in this discourse appears to have sat down and modeled, is what happens when the expansion ends. Mass layoffs produce sharp, durable declines in organizational morale. Not temporary ones, durable ones. The people who remain become measurably less productive. Institutional knowledge, accumulated over years of production cycles, exits the building permanently. The studio's capacity to execute the next project is structurally degraded, sometimes for years. And beyond the organizational damage, there is the simple math of what you can and cannot absorb. A 50-person project can exist within a large publisher. We have evidence of this. EA's originals, Microsoft's smaller titles, experimental projects at major studios. The constant is not that smaller projects are impossible. The constraint is that a company whose entire cost structure is calibrated for 1,500 people cannot be sustained by 50-person projects. The cost floor does not care about how small your current game is, it accrues regardless. So, the studio cannot not hire during expansion because production demands it, and it cannot cleanly reduce during contraction because the organizational costs and productivity and relations with the media and whatnot exceeds the payroll savings. The floor only moves upward. That is the ratchet, and the ratchet has a consequence that is entirely predictable and almost entirely undiscussed. Here is the concept I want you to carry out of this video. As organizations grow, their minimum viable project size grows with them. This is not a games industry phenomenon. A large bank cannot profitably pursue the same lending opportunities as a community lender. The overhead required to evaluate and service the loan exceeds the return. A multinational retailer cannot operate on corner store economics. Your corporate infrastructure costs more than the corner store generates. A major film studio cannot survive on independent film budgets. The distribution apparatus, the marketing operation, the executive layer all require a certain volume of revenue to justify their existence. AAA gaming, is not special in this regard. It is, however, a particularly visible example because the product is cultural and the layoffs are public and the discourse is extremely loud. What is special about the games industry is that nobody appears to be saying this out loud. The question, why don't they just make smaller games, assumes that organizational scale is a dial that can be turned down without consequence. It cannot. The cost floor is not a preference. The minimum viable project size is not a strategic choice. They are structural outputs of the organization's existing commitments, to headcount, to infrastructure, to the cost of simply existing as a large corporation. When a AAA studio makes a bloated open world that nobody asked for, that is not evidence of creative failure. It is evidence of a rational response to an organizational constraint. The project had to be large enough to justify the cost floor. The open world is an accounting decision wearing a creative costume. Now, I want to address the discourse directly, because it has earned it. The dominant narrative around AAA layoffs is a moral one. Executives are greedy. Studios overhired irresponsibly. They should have been more conservative. They should have anticipated the contraction. Let us apply some analysis. If studios had not hired aggressively during the expansion period, we would have a smaller industry with a thinner talent pipeline. Junior developers would not have been hired. Junior developers who are not hired do not become mid-level developers. Mid-level developers who do not exist do not become the senior engineers and creative leads that the next production cycle requires. And yet, many commentators who argue studios should not have overhired are frequently the same commentators who argue that the industry needs more entry-level pathways, more accessible onboarding, more investment in junior talent development. These two positions are not compatible. You cannot simultaneously condemn the expansion that created the jobs and mourn the contraction that eliminated them. Apologies. The labor pool the industry is grieving is downstream of the exact behavior being framed as villainous. There is no clean path. Every option carries a trade-off, and the discourse's refusal to acknowledge trade-offs does not make the trade-offs disappear. It simply assures that nobody is equipped to think about them clearly. Which then brings me to the argument that I actually want to make. Because everything that we have discussed so far, the burn rate, the ratchet, the minimum viable project size, the double bind of itself, is the setup. This is actually my thesis. Sustainability in headcount does not produce sustainability in skill reproduction. A stable, conservatively staffed studio of 40 people does not generate the next generation of senior engineers. It consumes them. The senior talent is doing senior work. There is no slack in the system for mentorship, for apprenticeship, for the slow development of junior capacity into intermediate competence and to genuine expertise. A stable small studio is, in terms of skill reproduction, extractive. It draws down the existing stock of expertise with no mechanism to replenish it. The growth episode, the aggressive, expensive, arguably irresponsible expansion, is not merely an increase in headcounts. It is the industry's apprenticeship engine. It is the mechanism by which junior developers get hired, receive mentorship, build institutional knowledge, make recoverable mistakes under senior supervision, and eventually become the people who can lead the next production cycle. Growth creates bubbles. Bubbles create waste. Wastes create training capacity. Training capacity creates future experts. That chain is uncomfortable because none of its individual links are attractive. Bubbles are bad. Waste is bad. Training capacity produced by waste sounds like it should be bad. And yet the output, a pipeline of skilled labor that the industry could not have produced any other way, is not bad. It is, in fact, the only mechanism available. When the industry contracts and the discourse demands sustainability, what it is functionally demanding is a system that cannot replace its own skills. Sustainability, in this context, is a sort of form of collapse, a managed decline, if you will. You preserve the current generation while eliminating the mechanism that produces the next one. And here is where the argument stops being about game studios. Because this is not unique to AAA development. It is the structure of every capital-intensive skilled industry that depends on growth episodes to function as its onboarding engine. Finance, film production, architecture, advanced manufacturing. The dependency on growth cycles to train the next generation of practitioners is not a bug in the system. It is, in the absence of any deliberate alternative, the system itself. What makes the game industry interesting is not that it has this problem, it is that it has this problem, loudly, in public, while the entire discourse is organized around the least useful possible frame, which is to say, who is to blame. AAA studios can't make smaller games because they can't. Not in the sense that somebody is forbidding it. in the sense that the organizational structure required to produce AAA games generates a cost floor, and the cost floor generates a minimum viable project size, and the minimum viable project size is incompatible with the economics of smaller games. And the more uncomfortable answer is that even if they could, even if you could somehow solve the cost floor problem and staff down cleanly and make the focused 40-person game, you would be eliminating the mechanism by which the next generation of developers learns to make games at all. The apprenticeship engine runs on growth, and growth creates the exact dynamics that everyone is currently complaining about. It's a problem without a solution, not a problem without a villain. There are plenty of candidates for that role, and the internet will supply them enthusiastically. A problem without a solution. A situation in which the thing generating the harm is also generating something you cannot do without. The discourse will continue to moralize. The executives will continue to be blamed. The layoffs will happen, and they will continue to be described as a choice rather than a mechanism. And the apprenticeship engine will continue to require the exact conditions everybody is trying to prevent because no one has proposed a viable alternative. I am the Art Economist, and I will see you people next time.